Hello everyone, today we are going to be having a look at the poem The Child Who Was Shot Dead by Soldiers at Nyanga by Ingrid Jonker. Just to give you a little bit of context, The Child Who Was Shot Dead is a poem of protest written by the South African poet Ingrid Jonker in response to the Sharpeville massacre which happened on the 21st of March in 1960. This piece speaks on the brutal massacres which occurred across South Africa during the apartheid regime. Jonker herself witnessed a black child that was shot by a white soldier and died in his mother's arms, and it was this shattering event which made her write the poem. Just a reminder, especially to matrics, that knowing the context of your poems is incredibly important. And you must also remember that whenever you're answering your contextual questions, whether or not you are discussing diction, imagery, structure, or tone, it is important that you always link your answers back to the context of your poem. Some of the themes that we will be dealing with in this poem are the themes of protest and resistance. And just so you know, in terms of the form of the poem, this is a poem of 5 stanzas of differing length. It follows no strict rhyme scheme or structure if we were to think about something like the sonnet, but rather we have a lot of repetition, especially with regard to words the child. So we'll speak a bit about anaphora. The poem's 5th stanza also ends in what we would call a coda, which is an epilogue that concludes a story. It is free verse, so as I said earlier, there's no definite rhyme scheme, and there's also a lot of enjambment, which we could say mimics the freedom of speech and thought, because remember, this is what we would call a protest poem. And if we are to think about the poem's intention, we would imagine that Ingrid Jonker would want a call to end suffering by standing together for the sake of saving other children, and to have a look at the injustices perpetrated by the government at the time, which was of course the apartheid government, and look at the need to vocalize these injustices and make them known to all. So I know that my matric students love to have a color key, so they know exactly what parts of the poem are diction, imagery, structure, tone, and mood. If you are annotating a poem while you are watching this video, you are welcome to create your own color key or to follow the one that I am using. But just so you know, I will be highlighting anything that is to do with diction in pink. Imagery will be in green, structure will be in red, tone will be in orange, and mood will be in purple. And hopefully you all know that when we speak about diction, we speak about individual word choice. Imagery, we think about more than one word descriptors, we think about figures of speech. Structure is anything to do with the actual, format of the poem, but we also look at things like enjambment and punctuation. Tone is to do with the speaker's attitude towards the subject, and mood is to do with the overall feel and atmosphere of the poem. So let's jump straight into stanza 1. The child is not dead. The child raises his fists against his mother, who screams Africa, screams the smell of freedom and heather in the locations of the heart under siege. So already you can see that I've highlighted the word child in pink, so it's a piece of diction. And the use of the word child really emphasizes the innocence of the youth. It highlights how many children were killed because of the apartheid laws. So if we think about it, the writer wants to focus on the fact that our victim is a child to really get across that message around the injustice of apartheid. Then we have anaphora or anaphora, which is the repetition of the phrase the child. So again, it's like the writer is trying to instill the child's memory and to tell the reader that the fight is ongoing. But it's interesting because we are told that the child is not dead, so this contradicts the title of the poem. And of course, the reason why the child is not dead is because the child is in fact a symbol of the growing sense of freedom in the hearts of people against the apartheid system. The child becomes a metaphor of resistance, hope, and innocence. I'm then going to highlight the use of the words fists, screams, and screams again. So this particular diction really does convey the distress and the anger of the child and the younger generation, and how they are rebelling against the injustices of the apartheid system. And the use of the word fists are not only showing us an element of fight, but also the fist is very symbolic of resistance. And it's interesting that the child raises his fists against his mother, not exactly the apartheid government. But this is, of course, to show us that the child is not happy with the older generation's submissive attitude. The child is unhappy that they did not fight hard enough. So now the youth is having to take it upon themselves to fight this battle. Our poet mentioned screams the smell of freedom and heather. Heather is, of course, a plant with small flowers, but it's almost like Jonker is trying to connect freedom to the smell of flowers. If we think about, an open field of flowers, we definitely get the sense of like open space and freedom. But it's also like she is making this connection between the smell of flowers, which is sweet, and the idea that freedom will be sweet for this younger generation. And then, of course, she mentions in the locations of the heart under siege. So these locations are specifically the townships, the places that are rarely seeing suffering. And the child's message will continue in the hearts of people who are oppressed or segregated from the mainstream. So those are the hearts under siege. Under siege, obviously, being under control, trapped. So this child is going to become an important symbol and reminder about why this fight needs to happen. We'll also notice that there's a lot of diction that is used that we can link to sort of military control, and siege being very much linked to military control. And if we are thinking about the tone of this poem, it is very much a tone of anger. There's lots of anger from the child who is screaming and raising his fists against his mother, wanting to inspire a fight for freedom. We're now moving on to stanza 2. The child raises his fists against his father in the march of the generations who scream Africa, scream the smell of justice and blood in the streets of his armed pride. So I'm sure you're all picking up on repeating, especially in the lines of who scream Africa, scream the smell. But we've obviously got some alterations in this one. So to start off with, we've got the child raising his fist against his father this time. So once again, this shows that the younger generation rebels against the system of the older generation. And it is a reminder that it is now time for the youth to take up the fight, because it's almost like the older generation seems to have failed in that. In the March of Generations, we are talking about the younger people who were prepared to go further. They were prepared to use violence. And if we have a look at our history books, we will see that many young South Africans joined the ANC military arm, which was Mkoto Wesizwe. So again, the March of Generations, the march of the youth who are prepared to fight no matter what to gain this freedom. As I said earlier, we have a lot of diction which alludes to military control. And over here we have the word march, which alludes to military actions. So again, this is a generation that is prepared to fight, prepared to perhaps even use violence to gain that freedom. And we've got the repetition line 3 in stanza 1. So again, just emphasizing their anger, the desperate cries of the oppressed people and the urgency to fight. That is obviously taken from the word scream over there. And now we've got the screaming for the smell of justice and blood. So this younger generation is willing to spill blood and sacrifice their lives for their freedom. And they will be fighting in the streets. So they are prepared to fight against the soldiers who patrolled the townships. Just so you know that the Sharpeville massacre was actually, when we're going to talk about it a little bit later as well, but that was a silent protest. Well, not a silent protest so much as a passive protest. There was no violence involved. And yet the people who were protesting were still killed as a result. So it's now the youth are prepared to, even use violence and force to get back their freedom, even if it means being killed, because it's almost like whether they're peaceful or not, they're going to be met with violence. And just to instill that message, they are fighting in the streets of his armed pride. So obviously his being the child who was shot dead, and armed pride is an image of fighting to restore one's dignity, to restore one's pride. And for stanza 2, we can say that the tone is very passionate and inspiring. There is a call for action, a call to fight for this freedom. In stanza 3, we have the lines, "The child is not dead, neither at Langa, nor at Nyanga, nor at Orlando, nor at Sharpeville, nor at the police station in Philippi, where he lies with a bullet in his head." So our lines, "the child is not dead," is repeated once again. So Jonker is emphasizing that the child is physically and medically dead, but not spiritually or poetically. The child lives on as a symbol of why the youth need to continue to fight. And we've got the mention of Langa, Nyanga, Orlando, and Sharpeville. So these are all black townships in the Cape and Gauteng. And these were sites of violence, of violent protests against apartheid. So at the time that the poet was writing this poem, protests had spread throughout the country. It was really becoming very heated politically as people were, ready to fight against these injustices and gain back their freedom after many years of oppression. And I'm going to repeat myself again, I am sorry, but the mention of Sharpeville is very important because, again, it is the allusion to the Sharpeville massacre, which, as I mentioned earlier, was when I think it was 6 protesters were killed by police, even though they were protesting silently. So I guess it also just heightens that message that the youth need to resort to a little bit more, I guess, violence and force to gain back their freedom. And Philippi is also a Cape Flats township where Jonker saw the body of the child that prompted this very poem. And it's interesting because we've got suddenly this paradox at the end of the stanza where he lies with a bullet in his head. And it's a paradox because throughout the poem, the poet has been mentioning that the child is not dead. But this, of course, highlights the fact that this child died physically, but is still alive in the hearts of all Africans and will continue to inspire them to continue their fight. And he, of course, becomes a symbol of innocence, resistance, and hope. For stanza 4, I've broken up the lines a little bit more. So these are lines 16 to 17, where we have the child is the shadow of the soldiers, on guard with guns and saracens and batons. So the child being a shadow of the soldiers is a metaphor. It's almost like the child is warning, or is a reminder of the possibility of violence, and that hope for change lies with the youth. It also conveys the idea that the child is like a shadow that is present wherever the soldiers gather. They cannot and must not forget what they have done in terms of their violence. And then Saracens are an armored car that is very much synonymous with apartheid in South Africa. And the mention of guns, Saracens, and batons, we are reminded again that the soldiers would use force to suppress black people, and weapons were very much used against peaceful demonstrators, so highlighting to us the injustices of the apartheid government, and of course, the sort of highlighting to us the devastating situation that these people and children were in. In lines 18 to 19 of stanza 4, it says, "The child is present at all meetings and legislations. The child peeps through the windows of houses and into the hearts of mothers." So when we mention all the meetings and legislations, we are being told that the death of the child is discussed by all people. This is a death that has been incredibly impactful. And the apartheid government tried to introduce new laws, while people of colour were inspired to fight against the government. So while laws were trying to be introduced to continue to suppress, people of colour were feeling even more inspired to fight against the government. And we've got the image of a child peeping through the windows of houses. So again, it's like this child's memory is ever present. Everyone is talking about the child, and it is leading to a gathering of forces to continue to fight. And the mention of into the hearts of mothers is Jonker's way of reminding us of this reality of the situation. Many mothers lost their children, so there's a huge amount of sadness in the situation, there's also a huge amount of hope as the child becomes this inspiration and reminder for people to fight. And then the final few lines of stanza 4, we have the child who just wanted to play in the sun of Nyanga is everywhere. The child who became a man treks through all of Africa. The child who became a giant travels through the whole world. So by mentioning this child who just wanted to play in the sun of Nyanga creates an image of an innocent victim who simply wanted to enjoy his childhood. So remember that context point that I made earlier? If you were to talk about this line, it would be not only critical that you spoke about the image of innocence over here, and the loss of that childhood that the apartheid government took away from the child, but also to mention that the reason why this image would be here in the poem is because it is a call for a fight for freedom. And this child is everywhere and treks through all of Africa. So as a symbol, the child affects all aspects of life and has become even more powerful and will inspire the whole continent. And the child is a giant. The child has become larger than life. The death of the child and others who fought for freedom has had a massive influence on the growing sense of freedom, justice, and resistance by all those who are oppressed. And the mention of this child being a giant that travels through the whole world again tells us that what happened to the child will have a global effect. Many countries protested against the brutal and unjust system of apartheid, and it was because of people like this who died as innocent victims against police brutality that inspired people to continue to fight, and to take matters into their own hands and to risk their lives really, to gain that freedom. And then finally we have stanza 5, which is just one line which says without a pass. So we should all know that the pass was used to restrict movement. It was the main reason for lots of violent protests in Langa, Nyanga, and Sharpeville. And this image of a child being without a pass really conveys the final message and irony of the poem, that the dead actually don't require a pass. However, ironically, you have to die to walk around freely. but it really does encapsulate this message of fight and freedom. And this is what we would call a coda. It is the epilogue that concludes the story of the poem. And I would go further as to say that it is incredibly impactful, that it is just one line that ends the poem. It really emphasizes the message, and lets the reader sit with that idea that the child is only free in death, and also instills that urge to fight for freedom, to fight for a life where people don't need a pass, where people can live without any kind of restriction. And that is the end of the poem. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to pop them in the comment section of this video, and I can get back to you.